I'm going to turn now to some questions from you. The first one, what would you consider a viable alternative to the current Palestinian situation? Would the current occupied territory serve as an adequate sovereign state with a government independent from Jewish influence? Professor Perle, can we start with you? All right, Mr. Perle. You want to join the university?
Well, I don't. I'm a lot less enthusiastic about that than I was an hour ago. I don't have an answer. And I think I probably differ from Professor Chomsky, who has an answer for absolutely everything. And we'll tell it to you at great length.
All right. What about the Palestinian situation?
I really don't have a solution, except to say that a precondition for any solution must be a recognition on the part of all parties of the legitimacy of all parties. That is, you cannot build a political agreement on the premise that a Jewish state in Palestine is illegitimate. It isn't going to happen. And if it did happen, it would not be stable or secure. So that seems to me the necessary first step. Professor Chomsky has all but acknowledged that he too thinks that the PLO ought to recognize the right of Israel to exist as an independent Jewish state in Palestine, and I hope he has more influence with them than he's likely to have with the makers of American foreign policy.
What about Professor Chomsky, what would you consider a viable alternative to the current Palestinian situation?
Well, there's an obvious viable alternative, and the international consensus that I described has in fact outlined it. Most of Europe, most of the aligned countries, the major Arab states, the mainstream of the PLO for well over a decade, have called for a two-state political settlement arrived at by negotiations leading to mutual recognition. PLO doesn't have to wait for my advice, which I wouldn't give them anyway, to call for mutual recognition of Israel and a new Palestine state. They've been calling for that for years. Now, if you listen to Mr. Perle carefully, you'll notice that a word was sneaked in there. That was the word recognition of their legitimacy. Now, that they will not do. And notice that there's an interesting diplomatic history with regard to the Middle East. The United States has been trying to block a settlement for a long time. After it became obvious that the PLO and the Arab states were quite willing to accept the existence of Israel, that is, to achieve a two-state settlement with recognized borders, with international guarantees, with mutual recognition, and so on. After it became obvious that this was possible, it was necessary to up the ante a notch. And what happened was, and here you take a look at recent American diplomatic history, again I urge you to look at the documents, very informative, you'll notice that the position was changed. It was not enough for them to recognize Israel. They had to recognize the legitimacy of Israel, or the right to exist of Israel. Now, right to exist is something that doesn't exist in international law. No state recognizes the right of any other state to exist. Mexico does not recognize the right of the United States.
The rights of other states to exist.
That's not true. We reject outright the right of the Soviet Union to exist in its present borders. That's why we have a captive nations week every year. Mexico does not, and we may be perfectly right in doing that. Mexico does not recognize the right of the United States to exist within its present borders, which happen to include a third of Mexico. In fact, in the international system, there is a notion of recognition of a state, but there is no notion of recognition of the legitimacy of a state. To call on the Palestinians to accept this new concept is to ask them to accept not only that there's a state in an area which they regard as their home, they're willing to recognize that, but to recognize the right of that state to have dispossessed them. Now, of course, they're not going to accept that, nor should they. There is no such thing in international affairs, and the effort to try to attain it is pointless and absurd. So let me now make clear that while the PLO has, with varying degrees of ambiguity, but often with great precision, I should say, called called for a political settlement with, along the lines I mentioned, Israel and the United States have been equally clear, namely in rejecting any such political settlement. The United States and Israel reject any, not only do they reject the right of the Palestinians to self-determination, they reject any manifestation of that right. In fact, U.S.-Israeli rejectionism is so extreme that the United States and Israel will not even permit the Palestinians to select their own representatives for eventual negotiations. That's really extreme. If somebody had come along in 1947 and said the Jews in Palestine can be represented, but not by the Zionists, we would have called that a regression to Nazism, correctly, and the same principle holds here. The fact that the PLO has engaged in terror, as have all, to my knowledge, other nationalist movements, including George Washington, obviously not to the point. By those standards, we would have rejected the Zionist movement, which engaged in extreme terror. In fact, the current Prime Minister of Israel, Yitzhak Shamir, was the head of one of the leading terrorist groups, the group that assassinated the UN Ambassador Pope Bernadotte, among many other atrocities, and was the author in 1947 of a pamphlet in which he not only advocated terror, but said that there is no moral barrier whatsoever to the use of terror, nor can there be. Well, yeah, that's what national movements are like, but that doesn't stop us from dealing with them. And it doesn't stop us, we're like that too. All of these are simply excuses to try to evade the political settlement that has long been possible. That's a political settlement among national groups which exist. One of them has its national existence realized in the state of Israel. The other is under military occupation. If we agree, there's a point of principle here, of course, if we agree that Palestinians have the same human rights as Jews, maybe we don't, but if we agree to that, then there is an obvious form of political settlement, namely the two-state settlement of the sort that we have rejected, that Israel rejects, just as its governing party continues to claim Jordan. No, I don't think we should back that. I think we should allow a move towards political settlement. It won't be easy. There are a lot of problems, but at least we can begin to move in that direction.
Let me pick another question.